mother had to work and was often away, um, making some poor decisions, feeling what handcuffs felt like on his wrist when he was only 11, getting involved in the wrong things. Uh, his mother, at her wits' end, puts him in Valley Forge Military Academy, and then he tries to run away 3 times. But it was at that military academy that he found not only the purpose that service gave him, but the leadership that he continued to cultivate, obviously in different roles, leading up to his being our 63rd governor here in Maryland. So the service year option program is very much working to tap into a number of things. One, every year in the state, we have a number of high school completers who don't report a next step. They've graduated, they got their diploma or their GED or certificate of completion, but they're not reporting job, military, or college. Where do they go? What do they do? Significant amount of human capital on the sidelines. Also tapping into the need for key areas of workforce development in the state. Maryland is not immune to a number of trends. We've seen, to some degree, people voting with their feet. For every one Maryland high school graduate who does go to university in the state, to leave, go to university elsewhere. That is not a sustainable pathway for us. Thirdly, service is very much one of the last convening spaces left where people do not check your prerequisites or who you voted for before they say, let's go do this common mission together, whether it's cleaning up a park or tutoring someone who needs help or feeding a hungry family. And so building a service program that is very much working to convene people from every part of the state. It's often said that Maryland is the country in miniature. We have built now 2 cohorts. We're in our 2nd cohort with individuals from almost every part of the state. The law that creates us is serving every region through vocational exploration, or SERVE Act. I'm proud to say that the 2nd cohort now of almost 600 people has individuals from every one of Maryland's 23 counties and Baltimore City. And if you've ever visited, or if your viewers have ever visited Maryland, it's a very real difference between Baltimore or Montgomery County or Prince George's County and maybe the Eastern Shore or Mountain Maryland out west in Garrett County. And capturing the full diversity of the different contexts that make up Maryland is important to have this shared experience where individuals will get hard and soft skills through their service. This is not a volunteer program. This is not an internship. This is a full-time service commitment for at least 9 months where they develop hard and soft skills, are consistently given financial literacy instruction, and also given civic literacy, civic engagement instruction through a nonpartisan lens. We're not aiming to be a new academic program, but it's important that our members understand how their government works. And even I'm so pleased to see we were with almost 200 of our members last week in person, walking through the election results in Maryland, and obviously the presidential. And our hundreds of members were able to have a reasoned discussion around the issues that motivated them to vote the way they did. And they did it in a respectful way, because newsflash, not everyone voted the same way. And so convening and creating space where these are individuals who are service-minded, civic-oriented, trying to discern where they go in life, and also looking at a way to use service as a bridge to remind people we are all part of this thing we call Maryland, and we have to respect the humanity of each other, regardless of what your vote was or wasn't. So that's in a nutshell what the service year option is. Our members are paid a living wage. Over time, we will grow the program to 2,000 members by 2026. So we effectively double the cohort every year, and require buy-in from employers who, over time, we hope that more and more of them see this as a reliable talent pipeline.
You know, I had read the article about the announcement of this program, and that Governor Moore said service saves. And I had intended that as a follow-up question for you, but you told the story off the top that was just so incredibly compelling. Thank you for sharing that background. It made everything.
And one last thing, because he's paraphrasing Sergeant Shriver, who was known for a much longer quote around the idea that it's in the end, it's the servants who will save us all. Another famous Marylander. So I just wanted to acknowledge the history there.
Well, that story certainly made what you said afterwards much more meaningful and more compelling even. And I apologize for the noise in the background. There's some work going on outside that I cannot control. I hope it's not too distracting. David, I'm going to turn to you next. You have a famous grandfather, and you have what I hope will become a really famous program that you've started. It's just fascinating. Please tell us all about it. I've really enjoyed learning about it, and I know our audience today will too.
Thank you, Tress. I appreciate it. And it was a great joy to bring this into the world at the end of my grandfather's life and to see it bring a glimmer to his eye. So about 6 years ago, first off, thank you to the PPI for having me. Rich, it's a pleasure to be here. And Paul and Robert, a joy to speak alongside you. Paul, again, Paul and I are on the webinar circuit these days. It's kind of fun. I don't know if I'm Bob and he's Bing or it's the other way around yet.
I'm just glad to be in the house, man. Good to see you.
Thanks. So about 6 years ago, I found myself the young man right out of graduate school, providing the legwork on a research project that was chaired by some folks much more distinguished and accomplished than myself. People like Paul Salmon of the PBS NewsHour, Bob Glauber of the Harvard Business School, Robert Putnam, Arlie Hochschild, Akhil Amar, the list went on. And our objective was to come up with a practical, scalable solution to polarization. It was 2018, 2019. We were seeing polarization on the rise across the world, and we saw how it really stalled our country. And it concerned us that no one had much of an idea what to do about it. And we, across about a 6-month period, learned a great deal about how to bring groups of people who are divided against each other together. And we also unearthed what we thought was a kind of extraordinary but quiet discovery. We found all over the United States teenagers voicing a common complaint to a question. When we would ask them, what's your least favorite thing about where you're growing up? Kids, again and again, from all walks of life, would say, I feel like I'm growing up in a bubble and I've never seen life outside the bubble. This is no shock. I mean, I think to an extent, 18-year-olds have always been George Bailey in Bedford Falls, wanting to shake the legs of their crummy little town and see the world. But to another extent, too, we know that American communities, and if there's anything that last week exposed, it was this, are becoming more and more politically and socioeconomically homogeneous. And that places adults in silos, I believe, and it also really limits the futures of young people by narrowing their horizons and their connections. And when we dug into the data, we realized that 3/4 of white Americans don't have a friend who's not white. 40% have never even met a farmer. And now, today, the least likely category of people to get married are Democrats and Republicans. In fact, I met about 2 weeks ago a woman who runs a sort of second chance at love adult dating platform. And she said 10 years ago, the most important question, or the first question you'd hear was, do you have kids that I'm going to be responsible for? And now it's, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? Only 4% of newlyweds are crossing the political aisle when they walk down that literal aisle. So we feel to an extent we are unable to talk to each other civilly. We are shunning each other. We are moving. We are changing our lives in major ways because we're afraid of each other. And we're afraid of each other probably because we don't know one another. And so our team thought, here's where we can intervene. Let's get young people to live in a different bubble for a while. And what better time to do that than at the end of high school and in the summer? So today we literally bring young people into each other's homes, into one another's lives through a domestic, free, first of its kind youth exchange program that sends high school seniors on a free week-long trip to an American town that is politically, socioeconomically, and culturally very different from the one that they're growing up in. So think Boston, Massachusetts to Dodge City, Kansas, Muskogee, Oklahoma to Seattle, Washington. The program is not explicitly framed around politics. We call it pre-political, on the thought that most of our political views and frankly our beliefs generally come from our lived experiences, and that for all people, but especially young people, those lived experiences are the byproducts of the circumstances in which we're living. And so if we're going to talk about our beliefs, we really need to understand the context that those beliefs are coming from so that we can better empathize with other people and make people heard and understand that they belong. And so that we can see that it's a huge and diverse country. And the project of civil discourse is really more about navigating nuance than out debating the person sitting across from you. We've put 1,000 kids through the program since our pilot program with 20 students in 2021. We've had 150 exchanges, 75 towns, 36 states. The towns run the gamut from Riggins, Idaho, which is 400 people, no stoplights on a little sand spit at the Salmon River in northern Idaho, up the smokestack there, to the Bronx and Los Angeles and San Francisco. The stories are too many to tell. We've had kids change college majors, transfer colleges because of exchange. There's a boy from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who's bringing his girlfriend to Homer, Alaska to pop the question next summer. We have, host moms saying, I have a daughter in Texas and now I have a daughter in New York. So the stories have been terrific, and they've been the subject of over 120 media coverage stories over the last 4 years. In fact, we were on Fox and Friends and Good Morning America in the same week. That was quite the expose and two sides of the divide. And then the data has been great too. We've partnered with the Harvard Kennedy School and Cal Berkeley to survey the kids, and we've seen bias going down significantly. We've seen faith in their fellow Americans, which Rich told us a little bit earlier is actually something that's on the down low today. And then also optimism for the future of the country, which I think, Rich, is behind that skepticism about democracy. We've seen optimism for the future of America go up significantly. And then on average, 2.7 new friends in their friend networks. I call it 3, but this is the PPI, so we'll be technical here. That's AEP.
Well, I can't wait to ask you some follow-up questions, but to the audience, I highly encourage you to find some video on this project. The stories that he mentioned airing on the media, they're really worth watching, and you might need a tissue or two. Finally, we have with us today Robert Pondiscio. Robert is an AEI fellow and a prolific author. He writes a lot on civic education, and he has been very passionate about bringing it into the classroom. And I'm going to ask him to tell you what he thinks about where we are today and what he's been working on to try to improve what he calls a national embarrassment of a lack of civic knowledge that doesn't even come close to what immigrants who are becoming American citizens have to know to pass the citizenship test.
Okay, so that means, Tressa, you have queued me up for what appears to be late in life, my lot in life, which is I seem fated to be the skunk at every picnic to which I'm invited. So after hearing these wonderful, bracing, and genuinely optimistic sounding initiatives and programs, I guess I will now be the bearer of bad news. One of the points that I've made over the years in writing about civic education, and by the way, I was a civics teacher for a time at a charter school in New York City. We just have to face facts that American K-12 education just doesn't think that this is its role, which is ironic, right? And Al Shanker, who Rick referred to earlier, understood this better than anybody. The founding purpose of public education in this country was not. I joke that Horace Mann went to his grave without ever having uttered the phrase college and career ready. That's not what public schools were for. They were for citizen making. They were to attach children to their country. So when Rick said earlier that we should be teaching those American ideals, I will see Rick and raise him one. We shouldn't merely be teaching them. We should be investing children in those ideals. And no, that does not mean a rose-colored view of history. You can do both. You can teach kids a veneration for those ideals while being clear-eyed about where we have fallen short of them. There's no contradiction in that whatsoever. But when I say, as I said a moment ago, that American education doesn't think that this is its role, don't take my word for it. There's data to support this, not the least of which is NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. My primary work in education concerns literacy. Well, it's no secret to anybody that we have a literacy crisis in this country and have had for several decades. Well, if you're in a sober mood sometime, take a look at NAEP scores on civics, history, and geography. They make literacy look robust. By far, the worst scoring test score in our country is our children's test scores on NAEP civics and history. I mean, it's on the order of like 25% of kids proficient, which again is far lower than literacy and math, which we are accustomed to describing as a crisis. But when I say that American education doesn't view this as its role anymore, some years ago, with some help from some colleagues of mine at the Fordham Institute, where I worked at the time, we did. I'm not going to call it a study, but we looked at the mission statements, the mission and vision statements. Every school district has them. When the school board gets together and they say, okay, what's our job here? What do we do? They write these mission and vision statements. And I don't want to suggest that teachers take them down when they decide what to teach. But it's interesting because this is when the people who are running our school system say, okay, what's our role here? What do we do? They're having a very different conversation than the one that we're having today. So the personal and private ends of education that I described earlier, that college and career ready metric, for example, that's much more in the minds of school district officials who write and adopt those statements. So, and I don't have this in front of me, but from memory, I believe in looking at the 100 largest mission statements in American education, 37, I think was the number out of 100 mention college, 46 mention career. Well over half of them make no mention whatsoever of civics and citizenship. It simply doesn't come up. When the word citizen comes up, it's more likely to come up in the phrase global citizen than U.S. citizen. And the one that I know Rick and I have been shocked to consider over the years is that the word patriotic or patriotism appears in literally none of those 100 district mission statements, the 100 largest in the country. Neither, surprisingly, does the word America or American, not even once. So all that I can conclude from that is that when, again, the people who run our school districts sit down and say, well, what do we do here? What's our job? What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? Civics and citizenship is just not part of that conversation.
When did we lose that?
A great question. The short answer is I don't know, but I assume over time, if you ask, let's not lay this in the dooryard of school districts. Let's put some of it on those of us with children, parents, as it were. When you ask, I've never done this, but I would assume if I were to ask parents, what do you want out of your child's school? They too would most likely most likely cite those private ends of career, college, get a good job, get a good education. They might not be thinking in terms of preparation for civic engagement.
Right. And Rick wrote a great report this last summer. He published it in July, calling Teaching Students What It Means to Be American. So following on this very theme that Robert's just talking about, Rick, you wrote in the short version, there's a sentence that reads, out of an understandable but false sense of security, educators have placed more emphasis on economic competitiveness than democratic citizenship. Given that, and given this election that we just had last week, has it changed has the outcome of the election changed your feeling about your project, about the false sense of security? Where do you stand on that?
Well, I'll say my co-panelists have been admirably high-minded and nonpartisan, but I'll be partisan for a second here. I do think that for Democrats in particular, the election gave us two big things. One is a challenge for democracy. We've elected an individual who, is very likely to put enormous strain on liberal democratic principles. So I think the work that we're all talking about building liberal democracy is more important than ever. And then kind of more parochially for the Democrats, the fact that the party has utterly lost touch with working Americans is connected as well. And normally these two things are seen as contradictory in terms of the democratic appeal. So Democrats were told, don't talk about democracy because working class people, understandably, have to focus on kitchen table issues, and democracy is a loser. That's kind of one of the things that has come out of this, the post-election analysis. But I actually think that embracing a liberal patriotic education, which the American Identity Project does, it connects to both of those concerns. So working Americans are particularly patriotic, according to polling. 69% of working class voters say America is the greatest country in the world, compared to 28% of progressive activists. And so embracing a liberal patriotic education, by which I mean one that teaches kids a love of the country, but also recognizes, we have a long way to go to include everyone in our society, ought to in the long run strengthen our democracy and better connect Democrats to working class families. I mean, the two things that most families care about most, and working class families in particular, are their kids and their country. And I think that if people on the center left were better able to embrace some of the issues that the right has successfully grabbed as their own, it's a way of reducing educational polarization, bringing the country together, and in the long term, making sure that our liberal democratic beliefs will hold, because there's no other way to do it than through education.
I guess it brings me to the question of, how do you get that into the classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll answer. And Robert, you're in the classroom, so you should jump in too. I mean, I think there are a number of groups that can help push this into the classroom. I work a lot with my friends in the teachers unions, and right now, I don't know that teachers unions are doing a great job of making sure that education schools and the teachers have the tools they need. But as a political matter, conservatives have pushed private school vouchers successfully in a number of different states. And so I think it becomes in the enlightened self-interest of teachers unions to reconnect what's being taught in schools to mainstream American values. And I know, Robert, you had one piece on this that said, for years, private school vouchers made very little progress. And it was only when a lot of Americans became upset about what was being taught in the public schools that you saw some advance. So for years, the argument was private school vouchers are necessary because low-income kids are trapped in bad schools and they need something better, which had a certain appeal to some folks. But when you said, more broadly, the public schools are not teaching American school children to love their country, that's when the movement, which I personally find very damaging. I think private school vouchers are not good for the country, but that's, I think, when they took off. And so that's why I suggest teachers unions could help move us to a better place on this issue.
I'll jump in. And cards on the table. Sure, I'm absolutely in favor of school choice. However, I'm not one of those who believes that it's a magic bullet. In other words, that competition is all we need in order to improve outcomes for all children. And honestly, Rick, and I've said this in front of my school choice ally friends, I am concerned about what happens not when we lose public schools, which, let's face it, have not really lived up to their promise over the years. But what happens when we lose the public school ideal? I'm an unabashed disciple, as you know, of a guy named E.D. Hirsch Jr., who has preached this and I think effectively for quite some time. A common knowledge base is the thing that should unite us, and I don't think that goes away if we democratize, so to speak, who delivers a public education as opposed to who gets one. That's almost a separate conversation. I want to come back to something, however, that you said, Rick, earlier, and that was kind of like a bit of a through line in a number of things that you've said here, with your concern about democracy. And look, on the one hand, I share that. On the other hand, I think we have to be clear-eyed and understand that word itself has been weaponized somewhat by the left against the right, and that troubles me. In other words, this should not be I don't want to say a dog whistle, but this is not a favoring. Protecting democracy is not a wholly owned subsidiary of the left, to put it that way. But you said something earlier about the need to safeguard diversity. Something else I've written about, and I feel like this is a body of knowledge that is just almost unknown in K-12 education. The key to making things safe for diversity, whether it's intellectual diversity, political diversity, or ethnic diversity, is sameness. There's a rich body of research in political science. I'm thinking of the work of Karen Stenner, who's an Australian political scientist, and John Haidt of NYU has written quite a bit about this as well, about how, and I can't remember whose image this was. I think it was John Haidt, that we all have an authoritarian button on our forehead, was the way he described it, that under certain conditions gets pressed. And the way it gets pressed is when we feel our in-group is threatened. So think of what we do in school sometime. We're forever, for all the right reasons, celebrating diversity, trying to draw favorable attention to it. Well, that's the thing that triggers that authoritarian impulse. But we have a unique opportunity as civic educators to do exactly the opposite through shared rituals, through common knowledge, through common curriculum, through celebrating those American ideals that we discussed earlier, to say in effect to children, hey, look, we can differ about all those things, but these are the things we have in common. And when you do that, you're actually creating the conditions where diversity no longer triggers that authoritarian impulse. In other words, I don't want to oversimplify it, but there are days I feel like we're doing this exactly wrong. That the ends that we are seeking to create in children, attaching children to country and community, creating the conditions that valorize diversity, that we'd be getting further faster if we did it by making a virtue of our sameness, not a virtue of our differences.
Yeah, I agree completely with that.
And I have a question for Paul. Robert talked about shared rituals, right? Is there a shared ritual element to your service project?
There's a couple of pieces and we're really only 18 months in, so we're building the plane as we fly it, and trying to not reinvent the wheel any more than we need to, in the sense of we do build in monthly in-person professional development training. There's a lot we could communicate to members related to their developing as young professionals, whatever they choose next. Financial literacy is a part of that. Digital hygiene, in terms of what their online profile says about them to potential employers or universities they may want to attend one day. Civic education, but doing it in person. That was one of my biggest regrets when I used to be the director of AmeriCorps Vista, the domestic version of the Peace Corps. Well, you would have vistas in Baltimore, all over the place, a different, nonprofit, government agency. They would never meet. They're all serving in Baltimore in the same federal program, giving a year of service on their own. And so building in these monthly touch points where we gather them as best we can in a place that is of significance in Maryland's history, taking them to St. Mary's County, where Maryland started, folks seeking religious liberty, or taking them to Cambridge, Maryland. We could tell them about Harriet Tubman, or we could take them to the place she was from. And so, delivering professional development training in a way that they can bump into one another. We do not put our thumb on the scale in terms of you're going to be paired up with you and you're going to be friends and you're going to, talk about what democracy means to you. But human beings have a way of connecting when you put them in the same space. And doing those professional development trainings at a regular clip every month where they can meet others in the same program they're a part of from different parts of the state, but connecting across lines of difference through this shared experience. That's one of the, I guess if there was a sort of ritual, that's one thing we've built in so far. But 18 months in, we're still looking at other ways to allow members to have human-to-human interaction where they hopefully can and will learn more about each other as people, even if they see the world and the state differently.
Well, it sounds like your program and David's program are seeking the same exact kind of experience, just from different angles and different ways. David, you mentioned some lasting impact from, like you gave the example of the young man who did his exchange in Alaska, and the place came to mean so much to him that now he's going to use that as the backdrop for his proposal to his future wife. But are you seeing anything that is building towards the more cohesive society, or is it still too young of a program where you're seeing ripples outward?
We're at the very nuclear level. We are absolutely seeing it. And you spoke about rituals. I'm very hopeful this can one day grow up to be America's next great civic rite of passage, that a week in a different town can be as much a part of the senior year of high school as the prom. And the good news we have is that we already have in our country the infrastructure to do it. We have enough people who can host kids. We have teachers who can run these programs. In fact, we're kind of making it happen already. The biggest knock-on effect we see is that every kid who travels connects with 30 other people during their week. I mean, that's 30 people who are hearing stories about another side of American life, 30 people for whom a kid who works with hogs every morning from South Dakota is a real person, not some aberration they hear from far away or some idea they have on the news media. One of the most interesting things I've learned through the program since we started, and I didn't expect this, it's not so much that young people have a negative impression of the other so much as they have no impression at all. We had a boy from the Bronx who we sent to a fishing town in the northern part of Massachusetts. And I asked him when I got there what he thought about his week. And he said, well, I'm amazed that there are people here. I said, Pete, what do you mean? So I thought the whole world was New York and that there was some stuff in Connecticut and the rest was just trees. And it reminded me of that New Yorker cover where it's like, it's the globe according to a New Yorker. And the whole thing is Manhattan. There's a little Eiffel Tower around the backside. And we all kind of think that way. And so when you connect with 30 other people, suddenly those worlds become real. And we've seen through oral histories and testimonials with our 1,000 alumni that the mom that hosts a kid has different conversations with her Republican women's group during their book talks every week. We see that the dad at his construction site is talking about political issues a little bit differently because of a young person that stayed in their home that they consider a second child now. We see kids who are the heads of the Jewish Student Union brokering very different conversations with the head of the Palestinian Student Union on college campuses around the country. And so it seems like we're exercising a really unexercised muscle in all of the people that the program touches, mostly so with the kids, but also with the parents that host these students, with the teachers that run the program, with the parents of the students themselves. And so when that batty uncle goes off at Thanksgiving about, you name it, that kid's putting their hand up and saying, no, I was there 3 months ago and it's not actually like that. The kicker, of course, is how do you, measure with surveys these impacts that we're hearing in the form of stories from so many of our kids. But what we've also seen is that there's a real knock-on effect to social capital, and that if you can do something strong at the unit of one, that will actually ripple out to a significant degree. So we sent 500 students through our program last year. We estimate anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 people were somehow associated with it. And so to answer your question, yes, we're seeing it. And I think that also suggests that if we can really scale it up to be a great program for high school kids, it can actually.
That was going to be my next question. How quickly do you think you can scale? What are your goals for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, last week may have had some bearing on that. I think there are tons of precedents for great social innovations that are so ubiquitous in our society, we forget that they were once a novel idea. Public libraries, education after the age of 13 years old, playgrounds, public parks. And what I've seen, being David McCullough III in history, is that it's critical you reach some, through acts, honestly, of philanthropy and hard work, that you reach some tipping point that makes folks who don't have a public library or a high school or a public park realize that the people who have those are a little happier and a little better off than we are. We ought to have one too. To answer your question, Tressa, we are actively working with 8 states around the country who've requested proposals to significantly scale up the program in those states. We are working with some of the largest philanthropists in the country to scale our presence outside of those states that we're currently working in. And I've just hired an incredible group of people who are figuring out in marketing and operations and development how we can bring in the capital, how we can develop the tech, and how we can really talk about the program in a way that'll help it grow across the country very quickly. And if we can do that well, then it's really just a function of funding, people power, and desire that will determine how quickly this thing can scale.
Right. It would be interesting if you took some potential donors along, I mean, I can speak from experience that, spending almost all of my adult life in downtown Chicago, and last year doing a report on some innovations in rural schools in Texas, and traveling to these schools somewhere in the middle between Corpus Christi and San Antonio, where there's not a whole lot of, or what do they call it? A whole lot of nada. That's what they call it. A whole lot of nada. I mean, it was so eye-opening for me as an adult. I just can't imagine what it would be like for a kid. And, Robert, we have a question specifically to you from someone in the audience. She would like to know if you have observed any school districts that are doing great, innovative, efficient things with regards to civics education. We can't hear you. I think you're muted. There we go.
I wish I could give you a better answer, because the short answer is no. And in fact, I'm a little bit concerned with what I perceive to be some fashionable trends in civic education that I think are another example of what I described earlier as wrong for all the right reasons. One of the big movements in civic education is the so-called action civics movement. And it's this idea that you're going to invest kids in making change by giving them the opportunity to, in fact, do that. In other words, you don't do student government, you do real government. You identify problems in your community, and then you make a project of addressing them. I did some of this work when I was a civics teacher at Democracy Prep, a charter school in New York City. And it's not that the project-based learning, as it were, is bad. But what concerns me is the message that it sends to children long term. In other words, I guess I don't want to make it an accusation, so I'll put it in the form of a question. Are we guilty of problematizing this country to students? In other words, if every input that you get about your country is that it's a collection of problems to be solved, well, then you're no longer necessarily cultivating that optimism and gratitude that I think is essential for children to be invested in their country and their community. So this is a good example, I think, of what I've described as being wrong for all the right reasons. I want to be very, very careful that I don't want to accuse those who do these things of being bad at their jobs or bad teachers or ill-intended. It is intended to empower children, to give them the sense of here's where the levers are and here's how you pull them. That's a very, very good thing. But unless that is preceded by or contextualized within gratitude for our shared ideals, optimism about the future. What I say is a good civic education could start with a preamble to the Constitution and that stirring language about in order to build a more perfect union. Now, if that's the goal, that we are building a more perfect union because we are committed to building that more perfect union, as opposed to here's all this bad and broken stuff in my neighborhood that now I'm going to fix. You got to balance it, right? It cannot just be a steady parade of horribles. civic education has to, I think, dwell in optimism and gratitude in order, because otherwise, then why bother, right? If the message we send to kids is everything is bad and broken, well, then at some point, why bother? We have to give them the why.
So to be less of a skunk, I'll say one example that I talk about in my report, and maybe my colleague Max, if you don't mind putting a link to the report in. I don't know. I'm 61 years old, and I struggle with getting that into the appropriate box. But the University of North Carolina has developed a curriculum that does talk about what it means to be an American. In there they talk about the country when it first began. You had immigrants from different parts of the world coming together, and they had to define what is this new creature, the American. And UNC Chapel Hill, I thought, did a very nice job of describing what teachers could do to talk about, as you suggest, Robert, what we have in common as Americans. You find out when you go abroad. That's when you really learn. Well, I can recognize these other Americans that I'm when I see them traveling, and it's not just their language. It's all sorts of features that make us distinctively American. Calling one another by our first names, to give one example. That's a small d democratic thing that we do that isn't necessarily true in a lot of countries. So anyway, UNC Chapel Hill, I urge you to look at their curriculum, the curriculum they've developed for K through 12 education.
And we also have a comment in the chat from Aruna Patel, and I apologize if I messed up your name, suggesting watching a documentary called Citizen Nation on PBS that was produced by the Center for Civic Education. So I just thought not everyone reads what's in the chat, so I just thought I'd illuminate that.
Paul, a comment, Tressa, just really briefly, because I realized I didn't answer the previous question. I'm a content-rich curriculum guy, and I mentioned before I'm a devotee of E.D. Hirsch Jr. and his core knowledge work. Well, that's essential too. So I don't want to give the idea that there's nothing good out there. One of the best things that we can do, and I'm speaking as a former elementary educator, is build that civic knowledge base. I realize I forgot to connect the dots in my description of civic of action civics. In other words, yes, we want kids to understand, as I said, where the levers are and how to pull them. But if that's not happening within the context of I understand how government is structured and work, then all they're doing, as I like to say, is learning how to march in someone else's army. At the elementary level, there's any number of good, rich civic education curricula, just knowledge-rich curricula that will build that foundation of knowledge. So when you get to be an older kid and you're working on these various projects, well, now I understand how it works. So it's a richer experience.
Thanks, Robert. We have another question from the audience, and I'm just going to throw it out, and you all can jump in as you see fit. She says, I can tell we have bipartisan views here today, and yet I see there is still some hesitancy to speak completely freely. How can we help students do this when it is so difficult for adults and educated, articulate ones at that?
I don't want to be a bandwidth hog, but I'll jump in on that. I wrote a paper for AEI some years ago urging that we return to codes of conduct for teachers. In other words, when I was a teacher, I taught basically functionally like a senior seminar in civics and democracy, which we talked about politics all the time. And I would say, if we get to the end of this class and you can tell me anything about my politics, I've failed. This is not about my views. This is about your views. And I'm also a former journalist where it's not that long ago where even if we acknowledge that objectivity may have been a myth, we felt a professional obligation to strive for it. I think that mindset needs to return to education so we can give kids the freedom to try out ideas and not worry that they're going to say something that's going to upset their teachers. This is a critical piece of, I think, classroom teaching, is to create the conditions that allow students, not teachers, to bring their whole self, as it were, to class.
Well, isn't that part of the reason, or maybe it's better to say, isn't that the reason in some cases, isn't that kind of why parents are pulling their kids out of public schools and using vouchers when they're available? And I mean, I've heard anecdotally that is part of it, that their kids are made to feel shame or guilt, or that they're,
Sure.
yeah.
Look, I am not one of those people who thinks that every one of 3.7 million public school teachers are what you see on libs of TikTok, for example, who are kind of using their classroom to as a performance space. But what I've always said is that in a world in which teachers took their obligations seriously, that would be unheard of. The fact that any teacher feels that they have the permission structure to go on social media and unburden themselves of their political views suggests that they feel no compunction about it, as if this is something that is a professional norm. So even if it's a small piece of the problem, a little bit is too much.
Teresa, I think the problem is as much peers as it is teachers. This was at the collegiate level, but I spoke at one college, and people told me it would be social death to express views that were not within a very narrowly confined orthodoxy. And what I do in my class, I teach at George Washington University, is to try to engage students in debates where they don't have to be seen as taking the view. They're assigned a view. You all need to articulate this side, because that opens up the conversation, and then people don't feel as though they won't be able to get a date because they said something in class that's unorthodox. So I think there are lots of tools that teachers can use to open up the discussion to be more robust.
But Rick, it's surprising. I had this exact same experience on the campus of Yale University within the last year, speaking to the Buckley Scholars Program, students who were kind of out and proud conservatives at Yale. And to a man or a woman, they said the same thing. They felt, and this is good, I suppose, they felt less constrained about speaking their mind in class than they did among their peers, which was fascinating to me.
And not in a good
also
way.
think there's a huge elephant in the room here, which we're not talking about, which is this guy right here too. My dad's been a high school teacher for 40 years. And he says that in homeroom at his high school, which is a random assortment of students that meet every morning for 10 minutes for all 4 years, just totally selected at random. They used to talk to each other, and now they sit there on their phones the entire time. What we see at AEP, and I'm biased because we're outside the classroom, we're outside the school space, is to actually get kids together who don't know each other, who cut across all different cliques and types. And if you think about how all kids tend to form cliques and groups, that is the tribal version of what adults are doing right now. They're mirroring that behavior. By getting them away from that, by getting them with people who are different from them, and then frankly getting out of their way, a lot of that sort of tribal cancel culture behavior goes out of the way. And it doesn't feel like social suicide to say a slightly deviant viewpoint because you're identifying with a group who's very different. So I think we also need to provide young people settings where they can socialize with many, many different types of other young people not from their sports teams, from their neighborhoods, from their clubs or subjects of interest. We're too often in school clustering kids with like-minded kids or like achieving kids. AP students stick with the AP students, football players stick with the football players. To get them to start socializing across groups and cliques, really outside of the purview of adults, would I think free up this behavior a lot more.
And just a couple of things on that note, we've tried to, in our program, sort of overcome academic tracking, because even if you went to the same high school, you didn't necessarily meet because you're all in IB classes, you're in AP classes, some are in gen ed. And just, I think, historical context, sort of no new thing under the sun. I mean, this is democracy in America, right? Like de Tocqueville wrote about this 200 years ago, just saying like, well, in Europe, you think something different, you think something wrong, they have a way of dealing with you. They lock you up or they kill you. But in America, they have this fate worse than death, where you're effectively just excluded. So that's not new. I'm just saying, just so we don't hopefully feel too pessimistic. This is an American issue, and in our program, we're very much trying to make it clear, whether you voted for Wes Moore or someone else for governor or whoever you voted for president, our goal is to create the space for you to recognize the humanity of your fellow Marylander and to not be on the sidelines, to use your voice in an educated way, and understand how your government works. So just making it clear, and we're at 9 weeks into the second cohort, so it's still early. We're trying to create that space where we do not take sides as far as my team goes. We just want to provoke our members to be full participants in their system of government.
And Paul, I had wanted to ask you, and then we went into a little bit more of the classroom stuff. What is Governor Moore's goal for society? I know he says service saves, and you told his story of how service saved him from probably not the greatest outcome as a young teenager, young man. But what is he hoping that this will do for society writ large?
That's a huge question. I think, to be brief, he wants to use service as a mechanism to help us get to know one another again. Not just because it's nice to do, but you sort of see what happens as communities turn inward or against others, or define themselves as to who they're not, and then easy to reject them as. To that partisan marriage stat that was shared, I think there was, there's more current research around. I don't think, if you don't share my partisan affiliation, I don't just think you're wrong. I think you're dangerous. I think we'd be better off if you weren't around. And service is very much, again, one of the last bridges left that addresses that polarization and also meets very practical needs for the state's workforce and economy. And I'm glad to see, Governor Cox in Utah has already gone down the road of replicating the service year option in Utah. New York has gone down the road as well. Other states are exploring it because the governor is trying to export this model because it's a national issue in terms of youth unemployment and the polarization we're seeing.
Thank you so much. So we have just 2 minutes left. My tradition is to throw it to my guests one at a time. Everybody gets a closing statement. I'm not going to ask. You can say whatever you want to say, promote your report, your project. David, let's start with you.
I just say thanks. There couldn't be a time more critical for this conversation, and our program and the delightful stories you heard today all happened because folks at talks like this listening decided that's not just a nice idea, that's a nice idea I'd like to get involved in. And so I encourage you to visit www.americanexchangeproject.org, host a kid, recommend a teacher, think of a school. If you're 18 and you're listening, travel yourself. The great ideas are out there. It's just up to us if we're going to decide to participate in them or not. That'll make all the difference.
Thank you so much. Robert, do you have a closing?
Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate the invitation. Thanks for PPI for having me. I guess I would ask teachers to reflect a little bit on what it is that they do when they get out of bed in the morning. It is uncontroversial for those of us who have been public school teachers to want to cultivate in students, for example, a lifelong love of reading. Nobody complains about that. Well, why not a lifelong love of country? Why not an investment in our shared narrative? That for some reason we've lost our way. That may feel jingoistic to us, but it shouldn't. This is why the generous taxpayers of this country pay our salaries, not to estrange children from their community and their country, but to attach them to it. So we need to rediscover that forgotten purpose.
Thank you, and that is, I wholeheartedly agree. Very important. Paul, your turn.
Well, thanks very much for letting me be a part of the conversation. If you know a 18 to 22-year-old in the state of Maryland who's looking to figure out their next step in life, please direct them to serve.maryland.gov. We're building a program that we hope is useful to the country.
Thank you, Paul. And Rick, you were the catalyst for this whole entire hour, so please have the last word.
Well, I was just thrilled by this discussion, and PPI and the American Identity Project are just beginning. I can tell you, we're going to highlight the work that you're doing, Paul, you, David, you, Robert, because what I heard today gives me a lot of hope that we can build a common American identity that will bridge the various divides that have afflicted us for so long.
Thanks so much. I encourage you all to check out Rick's project at Progressive Policy Institute online. There's a tab there that says projects. There's a drop down. You'll see American Identity Project. You also see my project, Reinventing America's Schools Project. And in closing, I would just like to thank everyone for their time, both the panelists and the attendees. And I want to give a huge shout out to the 74 Million Education Magazine. I neglected to mention them at the top. They are co-sponsoring this. This broadcast will be, it's been recorded. It will be on their website as well as our website and YouTube. So if you know of somebody that you think needs to hear some of the messages that that went out today, please pass along the link once it's up, which will be shortly. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.